Yeah, I've never thought about that before. It's just something I've noticed in you. And reading this article, I was thinking like maybe the aphantasia is a tool in that. And if that's the case, like I'm sorry, every time we talk, I want aphantasia just a little bit more. Because it would be nice to have some quiet and dark for once.
If you enjoy this podcast, show us some love and take a couple minutes to leave a 5-star review. It helps us get found by more listeners, and we greatly appreciate it. Aphantasia is a condition characterized by an inability to visualize mental images in one's mind. If you have just discovered that you or someone you love has aphantasia, or if you're just fascinated by the subject in general and love learning more about it, you are in the right place. The Discovering Your Mind podcast delves into all aspects of the mind's eye, including aphantasia, hyperphantasia, and everything in between. Content warning. This episode contains discussions of PTSD, suicide, self-harm, and other topics related to psychological disorders. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to the Discovering Your Mind podcast, brought to you by shanesbraindomain.com. I am your host today, Cole Williams. Bit of a change of pace. Joined by Shane Williams, aka Shane's Brain. Hey, Dad, how's it going?
Good. How you doing?
Pretty good. It's fun to be on this side of the hosting.
Yeah, and it's fun for me to be on this side of it. So
not as much work for you, I know. Yeah. All right. So we're going to be doing something a little different today. I'm taking control because, normally we focus on more the personal side of aphantasia, people's unique experiences and all of that. But today we're going to take a slightly different route, and we're going to take some time to talk about some research. So today is going to be all about aphantasia and psychological disorder, an article by Dan Cavadon-Taylor that simply outlines a lot of what we know now about how aphantasia connects to psychological disorders. It's not a lot. This hasn't been researched a ton, but the good thing about this article is it covers everything we know and then suggests what we can do in further research to know more, what we should research next. So what we're going to do is we're just going to kind of go through little parts of this article together. And we're going to talk about what some of this means, what it means for future research, what it means to us individually, and see what we can take away from it. Sound good?
Sounds good.
All right. So let's start with it's this introduction here. And it just goes over some of the current connections between mental imagery and disorders. So it says, a growing body of literature suggests that dysfunctions of mental imagery make significant contributions to a variety of psychopathologies. And so it includes in this post-traumatic stress disorder, a big one. It says PTSD may involve re-experiencing past trauma via involuntary imagery-based flashbacks. So what this is saying essentially is that PTSD pretty much needs imagery in order to happen the way it's described in diagnoses. What do you think about that?
Is that then suggesting that if you have aphantasia, you cannot have PTSD?
See, that's very interesting to think about, because I don't think that's true. I think it's still very possible to have PTSD because, there's not a lot of research on this, but I'm sure that it's happened before.
And I agree with that. I think it still happens, but just in a different way. It may be less or different,
One of the things I was thinking about is it talks specifically in the DSM-5, which is the current diagnostic manual for diagnosing disorders. Like that's what psychologists use to diagnose mental disorders. In there, and this, this may be cause to revise the DSM, but part of the criteria for PTSD is those imagery-based flashbacks. And I don't know if you necessarily have to have imagery to have a flashback, if you know what I mean, because a flashback is essentially a memory. When it's in this case, it's more of like an involuntary memory of something traumatic. But I don't think that necessarily has to be imagery based. It could be, if they have an inner monologue, it could be sound based. It could just be a thought, like an involuntary thought that comes at them. I don't know. I don't have aphantasia, so I don't know exactly what that would be like. But if you're following me here, I feel like it doesn't have to be imagery to be a flashback.
Yeah, I agree. I have aphantasia, but I don't have PTSD. So I'm not an expert on that end of it. But I can tell you that memories can be very triggering for me as well. I mean, they can bring up emotions, whether they be anger or frustration or hurt or those kind of things. It's not like just because it's not a visual memory, it doesn't have any impact on me because it's still there.
Right. So what's to say that somebody suffering from PTSD can't have aphantasia and still experience those strong traumatic feelings associated with their memories? There's just no visual involved.
A couple of weeks ago, I interviewed C. Michelle Jeffries. She thinks that she developed her hypophantasia because of trauma and PTSD, and she still deals with it.
Yeah, I don't think I've always had it. I think the aphantasia for me has been as a result of trauma. My brain, because of PTSD, my brain has changed the way it functions.
I think there are probably lots of instances other than the one I just mentioned that the mind or whatever it is fighting PTSD with aphantasia or hypophantasia, meaning this is so traumatic that in order to lessen this experience, we're going to develop this thing that will help us deal with it. Do you think that's possible?
Yes, I totally agree. Let me find this real fast. Let's jump to this part of the article because the article talks about this for a little bit, and it's been given a name. It's called non-congenital aphantasia, which simply means aphantasia that you weren't born with, that came from something. And so it talks about this because in talking about the relation between the two, it happens both ways. It lists sometimes where aphantasia can cause a psychological disorder such as depression. So it talks a lot about how aphantasia can cause mental deficits and vice versa. So it talks about this case study. It says a casual influence from aphantasia to psychological disorder may be possible. For one patient, being congenitally aphantasic seemingly led to poor work performance and eventual reactive depression. So he had aphantasia from birth, and it seems like that caused him to perform worse at work and have depression. That's just what the study says. And then it goes on to say the reverse influence from psychological disorder to aphantasia may also be possible.
So does the article clarify whether or not this person who struggled in their work and got depressed because of aphantasia, did they know they had aphantasia? And did finding out about it is what caused the depression?
That's a very good question.
Because a lot of people with it are blissfully unaware and they just figure everyone is like them. And it's not until they find out that everyone is not like them, that they start to feel shortchanged and gypped and depressed about it. Either makes them mad or makes them sad that they can't have what other people have. I've heard people express the sadness of not being able to remember their past loved ones, not being able to bring up their faces or hear their voices and those kind of things.
Yeah, and I can imagine that would be a cause for depression. So maybe that's the driving factor for that, is once you realize it and understand that people have something that you don't have, then it can start to feel like you're limited, like you're alone, various things. I want to read this one last part along these lines that I really like. It says, someone, and this backs up what we were talking about before. It says, someone with non-congenital aphantasia of a psychogenic origin may have acquired the condition as a result of trauma, with their lack of imagery being a coping mechanism. So the research supports that it's very possible for aphantasia to act as a defense mechanism. The brain is repressing that ability to avoid PTSD or other things. So in that way, it can almost act as a protection.
And it's interesting to note, too, on that my sister, Donna, had kind of the opposite experience.
Many years ago, I was in a terrible relationship, and it was full of trauma. And when I would go to sleep at night and close my eyes, well, before I could go to sleep, I'd close my eyes at night, I could still see the room around me that I was in. And I never thought about how I couldn't visualize anything else back then at the time until I heard about this. But I think it was my mind protecting me and thinking that I needed to see all of my surroundings and to see what was going on. And it went on for years. And it didn't matter where I was. I could be in a hotel room that I'd never been in before, and I'd close my eyes and still see the room. And as I was talking to you about this earlier, it was in color, which is something that I don't do. And it went on for many years, and now it's gone. The trauma left, and it doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah. One thing that I love about studying psychology is that it's very unpredictable. And we never know for sure what the brain is going to do, because once again, everybody's different. And so the best we can do when studying cognitive psychology is to take as many measurements as we can and try to find an average of what is most likely to occur. But it's really fun because you'll get all these cool stories of the brain will do amazing things to keep us alive, to protect us, to do what it thinks is most healthy for us. And for one person, that may be taking away the ability to visualize. And in Donna's case, it appears that it was to grant that ability temporarily.
And that's why I've approached this podcast the way I have, with just interviewing anybody and everybody that is willing, because I think there's no better way to showcase how unique everybody is than to just ask them all the same questions and just observe how all over the place they are, how different everybody is in all these different ways.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about some of these other disorders that it lists and how those kind of relate to aphantasia as well. So we've got major depressive disorder has also been connected to imagery. And we've talked about this a little bit before, but I really like this evidence. It says a number of studies have evidenced the existence of intrusive imagery-based memories in depressed individuals, with up to 87 to 96% of patients reporting flashbacks to negative life events. Moreover, when at their most hopeless, many depressed individuals report future-oriented imagery-based flash forwards to acts of suicide and self-harm. So essentially what it's saying is that in the studies they've done with depressive patients, most of them report that they're having these imagery-based flashbacks to depressing moments in their lives. And even when they're suicidal, they're imagining and picturing what they're going to do to themselves as far as suicide or self-harm. My question for you is, do you think this is only for people who can visualize?
Well, it's interesting that, just a few minutes ago, you read a quote about how people with aphantasia are linked to depression. And now this quote is kind of saying the opposite a little bit. I think there is a case for both. Somebody who is experiencing a memory or a future event on a much more close-up visual experience, that's got to have a larger effect than the way I experience things. It goes back to, we've talked about before with my wife, where I'll say something gross and she'll have this high reaction to it because she saw it and smelled it and, all those things. It was right there. Yeah. Where with me, it was just words. So I think that can definitely be a factor for sure. And even you're a great example, right? In your episode, you talked about, your struggles with depression and things like that. And you said it was so real, right? Like it was so hard to escape it because it was so real and so overwhelming.
I didn't just feel guilt in the way of, I did something wrong. I feel bad. I need to do something about it. When I felt guilt, and this is going back to sensations, it felt like I was being punched in the gut and dragged backwards by my feet. Like it felt like the world was caving around me and I was being dragged down to hell. If you could be in my body as I'm experiencing guilt, it's a full sensation. I'm not just thinking this in my mind. My skin goes cold. My hands start tingling. All the blood drains from my face and I start to feel lightheaded and sweaty. And it's like, it's a traumatic experience for me, or it has been in the past. It's not the same now.
Yeah, I cannot relate to that. Even though I have, my own experiences, I definitely think they're lesser or at least different in a way that it's not going to affect me in the same way.
So do you think that aphantasia makes depression better? Maybe?
Again, I would say it's individual. I think everybody's going to have a different take on that. But just speaking for myself, I think it has helped lessen it for me.
Okay.
Because I feel like I have experienced moments of depression, but I don't feel like it has been all consuming. And and when I found the tools that I needed and that worked for me, I came out of it very easily and quickly. And I know other people don't have that experience. It's much more permanent and difficult to get out of. And I think that applies to everybody, depending on your circumstances, whether you have aphantasia or not.
Yeah. Speaking for myself, I can say, as someone who visualizes, it's been very difficult for me to escape depressive symptoms without the help of medication. Just because that's the thing, is it almost feels like a visual trap where it's the only thing that is recurring in my mind. Those depressive imagery, worries, fears are constantly manifesting. And I mean, on a more personal note, I have had those flash forwards, as the article calls them, to acts of self-harm. And those are scary. And there's no way to explain how out of control that feels, because it's not like I want to think about those things, but they just come.
And it's very audible for you as well, right?
It's very audible and it's very sensory, which is even scarier when thinking about those kinds of things, which is extremely scary for those kinds of thoughts. So you can see how you might kind of get trapped in that. Like it feels like a psychological trap, and it's very scary and it's very real. And I don't know. I'm sure everybody experiences that differently, and I'm sure somebody with aphantasia can still experience these kinds of fears and depression and thoughts just in a different way. But I just know from a visual experience that those mind sensations make it all the more real and captivating.
Read the book that inspired this podcast, Aphantasia and Beyond, available on shanesbraindomain.com and Amazon.
This also talks about social phobia, like social anxiety. Saying socially phobic individuals frequently report intrusive negative images in social situations. Sometimes these are imagery-based memories of negative social interactions from the patient's past, but such imagery intrusions may also represent the patient as they are believed to appear now. So this is something I wanted to talk to you about a little bit more, because I don't think either one of us have necessarily social phobia, but neither one of us are super social people. And I kind of wanted to talk to you about like what your process is in like deciding you want to talk to people or not. Because I have had this happen to me where I've like play a future scenario in my mind where I get like embarrassed talking to somebody, and that makes me decide not to go approach somebody or talk to somebody. Like I had that a lot when I was dating and things. But I want to know if like that has happened to you in a different way, or if any sort of social anxiety has been caused for you.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've always applied that more to my introverted nature more than my aphantasia nature. I never really connected the two. So for me, whether I want to talk to somebody is really dependent upon my mood and if it's a topic that interests me, right? Small talk, I just can't do it. I'm terrible at it. It goes nowhere. I don't enjoy it. But if you get me talking about something I'm interested in, then I can talk your ear off. So to me,
as evidenced by this podcast.
Yeah. So yeah, I never do what you explained. You know, I'm going to play out this scenario, and I've talked to a lot of highly visual people. They do that constantly. They're always playing out conversations. They're always, and I never do that. So that plays no role in it for me, other than I know I suck at it. And most of the time I don't want to put myself through that, especially if I know it's just going to be small talk.
See, and that's something that's always kind of impressed me about you, is things are not often about anxiety for you. I feel like I do a lot of things motivated by like fears and anxiety, which is sad to say, but it's often true. But it seems like, and I've noticed this about you, is often the things you do and say are simply motivated out of, do I want to do it or not? And not over like fears about things. So what has been your experience with anxiety like over your life? Would you say you don't feel it very strongly at most points of the day or in your life, or does it have a role in your life?
So this is interesting too, because I have had huge amounts of anxiety in my life, but most of it has been due to doing stuff on other people's terms. When I am able to choose for myself and do things on my terms, that's where the anxiety goes away. But if it's, I have to do this because of, pressure to feed my family or pay the mortgage, or, religious reasons, like all these pressures of you have to do this and you have to do it this way, that causes me anxiety. But if I can tune into my authentic self and do things on my terms, which I've learned how to do here in the last few years, that's where peace enters, and that anxiety goes away. And sure, there are still times when I've got to do things I don't want to do, but I'm much more selective about that and purposeful about that. And there are certain things where, I'm just not going to do them anymore. I'm tired of people pleasing and all those things that used to cause me great anxiety.
So it sounds to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds to me like anxiety in your life has not been a product of yourself, but rather a product of others. Yeah. And that's very different from me, because I would say 90% of the time the anxiety I feel comes from here. It comes from things I'm saying to myself and worries and things that are coming from here, and the images and the playbacks of social situations and things that give me that anxiety. So that right there points to a kind of big difference, possibly, in aphantasia and mental imagery. And obviously it's probably different for everybody, but that could be a big one right there, is less anxiety for you. And I think the aphantasia is at least partially connected to that.
Yeah, I think absolutely it is, because as I've described my mind before, it's quiet and dark. It's not giving me a hard time. There is no anxiety or stress or worry in there, usually. It's not that I never worry or never stress, but I think it's definitely a different experience. I think it's lesser. As I've described, sometimes my thoughts are not front and center like they are for a lot of people. It's almost like they're in the next room taking a nap. I mean, sometimes I'm thinking and I can't even tell that I am. It's that vague and mysterious for me. So I think in that way, it definitely helps. And then, over my journey the past few years, I've made an effort to not worry. Like, that's one of my goals. Don't worry about stuff. Go with the flow. Take it as it comes. Don't stress if your computer freezes right as you're on a deadline. Okay, it did that. So whether you throw a fit about it or not, you still have to restart the computer and deal with it, right? So I've made efforts to kind of stay calm and stay peaceful. And I don't know if the aphantasia aids in that. It probably does.
Yeah, I've never thought about that before. It's just something I've noticed in you. And reading this article, I was thinking, like, maybe the aphantasia is a tool in that. And if that's the case, like, I'm sorry, every time we talk, I want aphantasia just a little bit more. Because it would be nice to have some quiet and dark for once. Okay, so let's talk about bipolar disorder. And this one's a little different because it's primarily a mood disorder. And so I didn't think it had anything to do with imagery. But this is what the article says. It says, a leading model in the clinical literature, the mood amplification model, identifies vivid, intrusive, future-oriented imagery as the mechanism whereby an initially positive mood spirals into mania or hypomania. So I don't know how much you know about bipolar disorder, but it's characterized by periods of depression and then periods of what's called mania, which is more than just a positive mood. Like, it is like an insanely positive mood. Typically very impulsive behavior takes place during mania, extreme productivity sometimes, but it's beyond just what you would say a normal happy mood. It's insane amounts of happy. So what it's proposing here is that imagery, or like really profound imagery, is what's rocketing people from a normal positive mood into this hypermania state. And I don't know about that one.
In the article, does it mention does it mention anything about hyperphantasia? I'm not very qualified at all to talk about this because I don't know much about it, honestly. But my curiosity is, I have talked to a lot of people with hyperphantasia, and it almost sounds like the article is saying that bipolar disorder is much more likely if you have hyperphantasia.
I was actually going to talk about that later, but we can talk about it now because it seems like a pretty good segue in. So the article talks about future directions for research, and this is actually one of the things they propose. So let me read just a little excerpt from that. It says, individuals with so-called hyperphantasia lie at the opposite end of the spectrum from aphantasics, having an abundance of mental imagery. As with the nature of the imagery deficit, various questions can be asked about this abundance. Is hyperphantasia an abundance of vivacity, frequency, maintenance, or voluntary control with respect to imagery? That issue aside, research into hyperphantasia is even more embryonic than research into aphantasia. But one hypothesis that bears investigating is whether the condition is a risk factor for conditions like maladaptive daydreaming. Maladaptive daydreaming is partially characterized by episodes of highly vivid imagery, sometimes initiated voluntarily, but sometimes occurring intrusively, that can absorb patients for up to hours at a time. Insofar as maladaptive daydreaming shows signs of being strongly related to obsessive compulsive disorder, hyperphantasia may pose a dual, if not multifaceted, risk for psychopathology. It seems to suggest a similar thing to what you're saying, where it can pose kind of the opposite risk as aphantasia, where the visualization is so profound, so involved, so in-depth and detailed that you can almost get lost in it.
Yep. I just interviewed Matthew Bachholt.
Right.
Who's the most hyperphantasia person I've ever talked to. And he mentioned that.
I would say probably the biggest negative is if you don't learn to control it. And luckily I did. And I'm glad that I did because, again, you've got a free universe there for you to do whatever you want with. And I think that for some people that could be a real trap to maybe perhaps even get stuck in that universe or to see the real world as less valuable because you can't change it, you can't alter it, you can't do whatever you want with it. I'm grateful, I guess, for the circumstances of my youth that taught me to learn how to control my imagination and master it, so that I guess so it didn't control me to some degree, at least emotionally, if nothing else.
That makes perfect sense, because if what's going on in your head is a million times better than reality, like, probably be easy to slip into that. So connecting that to bipolar disorder, that's very interesting. I didn't even think about that before you brought that up, that perhaps hyperphantasia is connected to bipolar in some way, that that intense imagery and stuff is what leads to manic episodes in some people. I don't know, but that would be an interesting thing for research to explore in the future. Yeah. And I'm sure we'll get there eventually. The last thing I wanted to talk about real fast before we get into the rest of the future directions. The last part is talking about a special category of disorders that very well shouldn't be possible for people with aphantasia, because they are listed as imagery dysfunctions, dysfunctions of the mind's eye. And these imagery dysfunctions are typically coincide with things such as schizophrenia, obsessive compulsive disorder, even anorexia nervosa in different ways. For example, with anorexia, people suffering from that often have a condition where they see themselves as more overweight than they actually are. like when they see themselves in the mirror, they actually see a more overweight person. Like that is how they see themselves.
Right.
And
I remember hearing that when I was a kid.
Yeah. And so this is a very interesting thing to think about as far as aphantasia goes, because if you don't have that strong mental imagery, how do things like schizophrenia or anorexia play out? We're still mostly in the dark on how that occurs.
With anorexia in particular, it's a little bit confusing because is that a mental image that they're seeing in the mirror, or is that something else?
And the same can be said for schizophrenia. Is it a mental image or is it something else? Because, I mean, people with schizophrenia see their hallucinations or even hear them or feel them as if they were in the world around them.
Right.
So that's a whole nother thing that I don't even know any of the answers to. Is aphantasia tied into those at all? Or is it something to do with like your actual seeing, like that part of the brain that deals with actual seeing? Honestly, I think it's a little bit of both. Because I think, especially with anorexia, it's taking a lot of those anxieties and fears and manifesting them into something you can actually see. So I think it does come from somewhere in the imagination. I don't know if it has to start out as a picture in the mind, though. Let's move on to a part that I think might make you kind of angry. It's something that the article goes rather in depth about, and so I think we should bring it up.
All right. I never get angry.
Okay, sure. So this part is about what it calls distinguishing mental imagery and different theories on what aphantasia could actually be. It says, although aphantasia is considered a deficit of imagery, a rival hypothesis is that it is a metacognitive deficit. This account is sometimes stated in the literature only to be swiftly rejected, but it has recently received some tentative support. The account is ambiguous on the nature of the deficit. While it is most naturally read as saying that aphantasia is really a deficit of introspection or access, it might also be understood as claiming that aphantasics lack a capacity for conscious imagery. If there is such thing as unconscious imagery, both disambiguations share a crucial commitment to the claim that aphantasia leaves this form of imagery intact. So to translate that a little bit.
So in layman's terms, what does that mean?
In layman's terms, it is saying that it's possible aphantasia is not a lack of imagery, but a person's lack of an ability to access that imagery. Meaning you still have it somewhere in your subconscious and it affects you, but you have the inability to access it on a conscious level. So if that were the case, that still means that things such as depression, the things we talked about with depression and anorexia and all those other things, the social anxiety and bipolar and everything, they still function in relatively the same way as they would with somebody that experiences conscious imagery, but you just aren't aware of it, is what it's saying.
I mean, I could be willing to accept that, especially since there are a lot of cases where, you know, either for a brief moment or whatever, people with aphantasia have seen images.
Right.
And sometimes it's, you know, it only happened once and it was early in the morning and this, you know, thing happened. So that does make sense to me on that level. But my other question with it is how could they possibly know that? Like, that seems like a guess.
That is a guess. It's a theory, and theories are just really formulated guesses. That's all it is. So Yeah, but the theory is, and once again, we really don't know this for sure, and I don't know how we could test it. But the theory is that those images are not gone from you; they're just lying below the surface.
Right, and perhaps that's why some of us have a different experience when we're asleep.
Mm-hmm.
Right, because I do dream, and I do see images in my dreams, I think, but it's still kind of in a weird way. Like, I wouldn't describe it as anything close to the way, I actually see images in real life. But there is something there that I'm accessing when I'm asleep differently than when I'm awake, for sure.
Okay. That's really interesting. But that's a really good point. That could be when people are dreaming, that's like almost unlocking their subconscious and allowing some of those abilities to come forward. And some people probably have a greater ability to do that than others.
Right. And I know there's a lot of research and people out there, trying to undo their aphantasia. They've got these methods, these exercises, and they feel like they can reverse it. And I feel like some people have had some success with that. So that's probably where the theory comes from, that it's not that it's absent. It's just that you can't, for whatever reason, get there.
It's some sort of cognitive block. And like we've said, for some people, that cognitive block happens on purpose to deal with trauma and repressed memories and things. I'm sure it does. In some cases, it's a mental defense, and that's not to say that can never come back. Perhaps sometime in the future that cognitive block can be removed, and that that subconscious imagery can come forward into the conscious mind. And that makes me wonder if it's possible for you. And I don't know if that's even a desire of yours, but that would be cool to see if somehow it's possible to unlock the subconscious.
Yeah, and I think it probably is. I would be interested if anyone out there listening has had that experience where you were aphantastic and have been able to reverse it, at least on some level. As far as I go, I don't know if I would like it permanently. I'd certainly like to try it out.
So the next thing I wanted to talk about, and this was kind of the end of the article, is it talks about future directions for research. Because obviously, as we've stated, we know far from everything on the subject of aphantasia in general and connected to psychological disorders. We just don't know enough. And so this article suggests some future things that could be researched as we learn more to broaden our understanding of aphantasia, potentially use this information to help people as we move forward. So the first one it talks about is distinguishing between intra-aphantasic groups and not just between aphantasics and non-aphantasics when inquiring into mental health histories. So what this is essentially saying is to make mental imagery distinguishing and reporting more consistent when we're talking about mental health things. Because right now, when we're talking about mental health reporting, it's either saying I can visualize or I can't visualize. And really, there's much more to that, including the categories like hypophantasia and hyperphantasia, and reporting that when we are diagnosing mental health disorders could be very helpful for this, as well as understanding and reporting whether people have congenital or non-congenital aphantasia, whether they were born with it or whether they recently developed it and when they developed it. Having these different categories of aphantasia, I know that we don't typically like to categorize because everybody's unique, but having at least some broad categories in aphantasia helps us understand a little bit more about how it develops and how different people experience it and how the different forms of it impact our mental health. It might be really interesting down the road if we can get research that shows, people that develop aphantasia later in life are more likely to experience depression than those who were born with it and such.
I think one of the biggest hurdles that we still have to overcome is awareness. Right? There's still so many people and professionals who either don't know about it or dismiss it.
And that's a huge problem, especially in the medical world. The medical world is notorious for taking forever to accept that something's real. Unfortunately, the only remedy for this is time. The more concrete evidence we have, the more research is put into it, the more the message is spread, the more and more the medical world, the scientific world, the freaking gurus will slowly start to accept.
I would add to that the education system.
Right.
That's a huge one. There's so much that could be done there if the education system was more aware of it.
So, yeah, the best solution to it, unfortunately, is just to keep going, doing what we're doing what researchers are doing, just continuing to build this mound of evidence and research and arguments that we have. And eventually, more and more people will get on board. I honestly think that the earlier we get those categories in, the more it'll help us in the future. Because you're right, a lot of people don't subscribe to it right now. But the more we can kind of create a basis for diagnosis and for categorization now, the easier it's going to be later to categorize it. Because I don't know if you've noticed, but the medical world loves to diagnose and put things in boxes.
Right.
Because it's the easiest way to understand things. In reality, it's maybe not the best method, because putting everybody in, say, the box of depression does not really categorize it, because every condition of depression is different. But forming those categorizations helps us be able to bring it to the medical world for better understanding and treatment. So creating a basis for categorization now could help the medical world digest it a little bit better.
What comes to mind when you're talking about that is I'm glad that people are studying it, and I'm very interested in the research as well. But sometimes when you go to the zoo, it's nice to just look at the animals, right? And not try and figure out, what is this thing called and what does this mean? Sometimes I just like to observe it.
Yeah. And it really is best to have both worlds involved. Yeah. We get to admire it, and we can also start to understand it. Because to be perfectly honest, psychology still has a long way in understanding how the mind works at all. We know a lot more than we did 50 years ago, obviously. But we still have a long way to go to really understand how the mind works at all. And aphantasia to some people represents a little key to understanding more about how the brain works. And so that's why it's researched, and like as popular as it is right now in the research community, is it's this new thing that we get to play with. And researchers love to just take this little bit of information we get and test it against everything we already know. And
I do appreciate that, because what it tells me is they understand that we're not all the same. And they're embracing that. You know, I've talked before about that guy who said, "You're not so special that you're the only person on the planet that can't do this," right? These these large sweeping assumptions that we're all the same.
Right.
And I love that the researchers are debunking that and studying our differences.
Yeah. And it's great because we're getting into these really niche people, like such as aphantastic depressive people. Like, we're getting into these really niche people, and it's really unlocking just how unique the human brain is, because these specific combinations of conditions create these beautifully unique people, and everybody has their own unique combination of these conditions and characteristics that make them 100% unique. Because you've got your own form of aphantasia interacting with your own form of bipolar, interacting with your own specific upbringing, interacting with your own specific biology. And all of this works together to make a 100% unique person. So I think the research not only adds to, but accentuates the uniqueness that we all have, because it shows us how it happens. Not 100%, but it gives us clues as to how we make unique people.
Well said.
The other parts, future directions, assessing whether psychopathology in aphantasics is treatable via imagery-based interventions. This goes back to that subconscious thing. Aphantasia is really just, imagery locked in the subconscious. Maybe imagery-based interventions for disorders could still work. I don't think so, because it usually involves imagining things, and if they can't do that, then it's less effective. And this is talking about curing psychological disorders or treating psychological disorders. And what it's asking is, can we treat people with aphantasia the same way we treat people with mental imagery?
It's one of the reasons, interestingly enough, I was going through, I go to therapy for the PTSD, and EMDR doesn't work for me because I can't really literally recall that memory and relive the memory in order to process it. So
Right.
we use, instead of using EMDR, we use ART for me. And that is even really hard for me, because she's like, okay, imagine this. And I'm like, I'm trying.
Right.
That's one of the reasons that I decided to go into like art therapy and somatic movement and those kinds of things, because processing trauma using somatic processing and those kinds of things didn't require me to either imagine something or for me to relive a memory. I can think of a situation or a trauma that happened to me, and then I can scribble, or I can finger paint, or I can play with sand, or I can turn my music up really loud and either just listen as the bass drum and the bass guitar processes for me, or I can start dancing or something. But that's how I process. I cannot do traditional EMDR.
Yeah, see, that's very interesting. And that could be a total overhaul of the therapeutic world, if you get what I'm saying. Like, understanding aphantasia, and if it truly is, like, at least for the majority of aphantasics, like, different, or like therapy needs to be different, that could be a total overhaul of the therapeutic community, because now we got to split in half. Like, not only do I specialize in like cognitive behavioral therapy, now I specialize in cognitive behavioral therapy for individuals with aphantasia. Like, it could become a completely different therapeutic direction.
Yeah. And I think that definitely has to happen. There's too big of a difference there for the same things to work.
Right. We talked about this a little bit with like simple things like meditation before, how we totally different forms of meditation work for the two of us, and it could branch more into deeper therapeutic things.
So have you heard of art therapy?
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah, art therapy is a way of using art, sand play, music, those kinds of things in order to process emotions. I'm definitely not a therapist. I don't have a degree or anything, but I can be trained, and I'm working on being trained in using art and sound and those kinds of things in order to help facilitate processing for the body, emotions and stuff.
And that's interesting because, once again, it takes, it's not relying on what you can imagine and hear, but more what you can put out into the world. You know, it's more of what you can feel, you can see, what you can create. So it takes maybe what you can't create in here and allows you to experience it outside of the body. Maybe that's more helpful in general for people with aphantasia. I don't know. That's something research is going to have to discover.
Yeah, and I think it applies to everything. I think there's no one size fits all approach to anything. You know, education, you know, meditation, you pick the subject, and there's somebody somewhere that's saying this is the way to do it. And there's those of us, you know, on the fringes saying that just doesn't work for me. It may work for the 99%, but there's always going to be people that are just different in whatever way.
Yeah. And something I'm happy about is that psychology is finally turning to the 1%. Is for the last several hundred years, the research has been on the 99% because that's what we're trying to figure out first and foremost is what works for most people, because we want to help as many people as possible, you know. So what works for most people, and you know, that's where we got a lot of our medication and a lot of our tried and true, you know, cognitive behavioral therapy is, you know, we found what worked for most people, and now we get to kind of turn to everybody. You know, what works for the minorities, and what works for people with these specific conditions, what works for children, what works for geriatrics. And you know, now we're kind of specializing into different areas of the human being, and it's really exciting to see psychology do that. And I think aphantasia is kind of like the next frontier for that, is how can we help people specifically with aphantasia, you know, live better lives. And I'm not saying you guys live worse lives, but everybody has problems, you know, and to get the best help possible is ultimately the best outcome we can have.
Agreed.
And that's the article. So just a broad sweep of everything we know and everything we need to know, or a lot of things we need to know.
Did we skip over the multiple personalities thing? Was that part of it?
Unfortunately, it was not mentioned. I don't think there's really been much. I tried to dig for stuff on dissociative identity disorder and aphantasia. The only thing I could find was a Reddit post from like 5 years ago. Somebody talking about how their multiple personalities all have aphantasia, and so they can't imagine each other. It was very weird.
All right.
I'm super interested in it though. So if anybody out there, if anybody can point us to research or experiences or wants to tell their story, we'd be glad to hear it. So, because that would be super interesting to learn more about. That's all that the article had to say. Are there any big takeaways you have from that?
It's definitely very interesting, and a lot of things that I've never thought about before or never really considered before. So yeah, that was very interesting, very enlightening. And, you know, again, it feels like just barely scratching the surface on what can be learned and studied and explored with a lot of those areas.
Yeah. I think one thing I think we take this away from pretty much every podcast we do, but one of the big things I took away from it again is that everybody is unique. And there are different conditions, different experiences, different parts of you that make you 100% unique. And the work of psychology in that way is never done. That we're always discovering new things. Aphantasia is just one of those new things that we're all really excited about and that is going to make huge waves in the psychological community. I'm excited to just see where it all goes as we get to explore more and more unique people and apply what we know to try and help people achieve their own goals, deal with their own personal problems. And as we know more about aphantasia, the more that we'll be able to help this unique group of individuals. So I'm really excited for where it's going.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, follow, and engage with us, and share it with your friends and family as we continue to explore this fascinating subject. For additional information about this episode or Shane's Brain, check out the show notes. Thanks for listening to the Discovering Your Mind podcast. You are beautifully unique.